Hi, I'm John Tuckfield. I've been a Latin teacher for over 36 years and very heavily involved in the VCE. The idea of this video is for students and for their parents, just to help get your minds around what's required, what VCE Latin Unit 1 is all about. So starting on your VCE Latin journey. The first thing is to have a look at the official document. So if you go to the website, the address is given here, but much easier just to Google VCE Latin, and that will get you to the launch page for Latin on the VCAA website, which has got all the documents which you need: the study design, the advice to teachers, past exams and examiners' reports, and a few other things. But the one we're going to be focusing on today is the study design. So let's have a look at that. Again, you can download a copy of this. Now, the study designs are meant for teachers rather than students, but the VCAA is pretty good and open. So it's not a bad thing for students and parents just to familiarise themselves with what's in the study design. The first thing is just to do a check and make sure you're looking at the right one. The VCAA reissues study designs every few years, so just check the accreditation period includes the current year. This one does, obviously. This is the official guidelines from the VCAA. It's written by teachers, but under supervision from the VCAA, and they give some strong guidelines onto what's required. It then goes through a pretty severe vetting process and gets everyone fairly happy with it before it's finally launched. Teachers have got to follow this. If they're going to be offering VCE Latin, then they've got to follow this. No ifs or buts. Now, you can add to it as a teacher, but this, I guess, sets out the minimum. So you've got to at least do everything that's covered in this. If you want to do more stuff, then yeah, that's great. Let's have a look at it in a bit more detail. So if we open it up, the first section is really, frankly, a bit generic. I'd certainly advise you to have a look and read through it. It's interesting, but it really gets interesting when they come to what they call cross-study specifications. And what they mean by cross-study specifications is these are the areas that are common to all of Latin Units 1, 2, 3, and 4. They underbed the whole thing. So if we go to that page, the first thing we find is a section on grammar. So this is the big list of all the grammar which you're expected to know. It's broken up into accidents, and accidents just means endings, so tables, and syntax, which is the way the words fit together to make sense in a sentence. So between those two, accidents is the tables, syntax is if you like, the rules of grammar. Those two together make up the grammar of the language. Now, this is all you're expected to know. And it's a fairly huge and daunting list, as you'll see. It goes on for page after page. It does set out the limitations for what the exam setters are able to include, for example, in the unseen translation on the final exam. If it's not in this, then it really shouldn't be in the passage. I guess the thing to say at the outset is no one expects you to know this when you're starting VCE. You will have done most of it, probably about half to 2/3 of it, but there'll be gaps. And that's the point in 11 years in Units 1, 2, 3, and 4, is that you'll gradually cover off, hopefully, all of those things which might be a little bit new to you. If we have a look in them, there's a few things which might strike you if that you haven't seen before. Semi-deponent verbs, for example, might jump out and you say, what on earth is them? Well, you'll learn about them. You've actually done a few. Irregular verbs, you should be pretty good with them. Maybe they're compounds. So everyone knows the word sum, I am. A compound is ad sum, I'm here. Ab sum, I'm not here, etc. Lots of stuff which you know there. The supine might well be new to you. It continues on more and more. Again, most of these terms should be reasonably familiar to you. Under adjectives, you're not used to the term comparative. So comparative more, so positive is just the normal base form of the adjective. And then you've got comparative more, superlative most. A possessive adjective, just a word like meus, my, or tuus, your, etc. When it gets onto cases, that's really onto the syntax side. So up to here, it's been very much on the accidents, the tables, and then from cases onwards, it's the syntax. It's the rules of grammar as to how things go. Many of these you'll be familiar with, but there'll be a few new ones. Some of them you might not have just seen the grammatical term. For example, under accusative, it lifts double accusative. That's not as scary as it sounds. If you say, I teach him Latin, him is accusative and Latin's accusative. That's all it is. These will come out as you do your studies over the next 2 years. Your sentence and phrase types, again, much of this should be familiar, but there'll be a few things which maybe you haven't covered. Maybe you haven't done conditional clauses. Causal clauses, just words like because and so on. So part of the trick of this is getting used to the language, the terminology that's used for it. Gerundives you should be familiar with, but maybe gerunds not. That might be something waiting for you in Units 1 and 2. If you look down the bottom, there's a couple of important things. Phonology, which is pronunciation. So Sydney Allen's book, Vox Latina, is the book on Latin pronunciation. It's extremely very, very good, extremely authoritative. You're not expected to get a copy of this. You don't need to. But if in doubt, that's kind of the final arbiter. You might be wondering why pronunciation is important, and you're not going to meet any Romans to speak to. But when you're doing poetry in particular, getting the pronunciation means that you'll start to get the poetry, the other things happening in the poetry correct. So pronunciation is pretty important. The last note down there, which you might not be able to read, but it says in the exam, V is used for U. It's a little bit misleading, actually, that statement. What they mean is the letter V is used for a consonantal U. In Latin, the letter U can be both or either a consonant or a vowel. The Romans use the same symbol for both of them. And some dictionaries, like the Oxford Latin Dictionary, leaves them all as the letter U. So they would spell the word for a road, via, U-I-A. And you've got to work out for yourself, is that a vowel, an U sound, or a consonant, a W sound? However, most Latin courses, like Cambridge Latin course, Oxford Latin course, take the work out for us, and they will write the letter, when U is a consonant, they'll write it as a V. And all they're saying there is they'll be doing the same thing. So nothing really to worry about there, nothing new. The next thing on the common ideas is the literary techniques list, literary, stylistic and structural techniques. And these particularly come into their own in Unit 4 especially, but into the other units to some degree as well. These are all the things, the techniques that Roman writers use, and that's going to be a pretty important part of your study in VCE Latin. Now, a lot of these are going to be really familiar to you. You should know terms like alliteration and simile from your English study over the last few years. You might know onomatopoeia, even if you can't spell it. But there's also going to be lots of ones which are completely new. Chiasmus, hyperbaton, polyptoton, there's a ton of them. This is the list which you're expected to know. The good thing is it sets out the limitations for the scene text study in your SAC and the final exam. Now, this is good because there are actually a ton more of these literary techniques which they could include, but this makes it a bit finite. So this is a finite list that you need to know. You need to know all of these, but you not expect to know all of this at the start. Most of them you won't really come into until Unit 4. So there's no point getting sort of a head start on these ones, but certainly by the end of the exam and the end of Unit 4, yep, you've got to know these and know them all. Many of them, you really got to see them in action before they'll start making sense. Also under that is a section on metre, and this is something which you're going to come into in Unit 2. Metre is the way the Latin poetry works, and Latin poetry is completely different to English poetry. It's quite a complicated and a very different system that they use. Now, this is something, again, which you really shouldn't worry about until you get up to it in Unit 2, and again return to it in Unit 4. It's a skill which you have to have for the exam at the end of Year 12, but it's something which I'd advise you just to park for the moment and wait until you meet it and get into it in Units 2 and 4. There is a bit of other stuff. Vocab. Now, there's no set vocab list. And what you do for vocab is going to be entirely up to you and your school. So there's no vocab, and you see the point underneath that is dictionaries. So you might be thinking to yourself, if I'm allowed a dictionary for the final exam, then why bother learning vocab? And the only reason you would learn vocab is just to make things quicker and easier for you. If you've got to look up every single word in the exam, then that's all you have time to do. If you've got a large number of words up in your long-term memory, then you'll be able to spend your exam time for actually thinking rather than just looking up words. So I'd advise you just to keep up those vocab skills that you're doing. The dictionary, a Latin, English, English, Latin, usually just a single volume, but you could, I guess, have it in more than one. You have to check the fine print on that one. It's a print one, not an online one. And because that's the one you'll be using in your final exam, I'd advise you to get pretty familiar with using your paper dictionary, how it's laid out, what abbreviations they use, and just get yourself so you're a bit of a gem at it. Some print dictionaries have got a grammar guide, a little accident section at the back, and that's perfectly allowed. So it's any print dictionary which you want to have, and there's quite a few very good ones out there available. The next is the idea of scene texts. And a scene text is a book that you study in class. So you read it, you study, you talk about it, you work it out in class, and then you test it on it. So it's called scene because before you do the test on it, you've had a chance to see it and study it. And scene text, VCE Latin is made up of a combination of seen and unseen texts. Unseen is when the work's just sprung on you, you've got no prior preparation, it's just given to you, and bang, you've got to translate it on the spot. So it's a combination of seen and unseen in Units 1, 2, 3 and 4. Let's have a look in detail at Unit 1 to get ourselves started. So it's broken up into a series of areas of study. And these areas of study overlap, but they're really the focus for what the teacher needs to have in what they're doing. And the first one is called the transition from adapted Latin to original Latin. It's really going to be centered on reading scene texts. So your teacher will choose a Roman author. It might be a historian like Livy, someone like Caesar, Julius Caesar, but the writings of someone like that. But it could be anyone. And the idea is to bridge that gap between the made-up Latin, because in your Latin courses, like Cambridge Latin course or Oxford Latin course, all the Latin there is made up by the good folk at Cambridge and Oxford universities, but it's made up nevertheless. And you're jumping from that to reading Latin by an original Roman author. And you're going to find that gap is pretty massive. No matter how hard you thought things were getting towards the end of Year 10, that there is a big jump between that and reading Latin by a real Roman author. So in Unit 1, Area of Study 1, maybe there'll still be some slight adaptations happening. It could be that your teacher might just rearrange the word order slightly. So the subject, instead of being 5 lines down, the subject is actually at the start of the sentence where you might expect it. Or they might cut out, if the author is digressing, as Roman authors tend to do, maybe cut out a few paragraphs or even sentences here and there, just so the narrative flows a bit better. Your aim is both to translate and to understand the grammar. So not just be able to translate, but be able to say why. So, why does that word end like that? What kind of case is being used here? And that refers back to the big list of grammar, the accents and syntax we had at the start. They do list an outcome for it, and after you study the passages of class, can you translate the passages? Well, I really hope the answer to that one's going to be yes, and answer questions on the grammar. So that means while you're going through, you should be asking your teacher, hey, I don't understand why the subjunctive is being used in this sense. Can you just help me with that one? We then jump on to Area of Study 2, and Understanding the content and context of Latin passages, you're probably still reading the same scene text we looked at for area of study 1, but now we're looking at with the idea of actually how much do you really understand. It's drawing the distinction between translation and understanding. So sure, you can translate a sentence, and to do that you need to know the grammar of it, but can you understand what the author's actually saying? And that means you really need to have a lot of background knowledge. The first is just the basics of the story, plot, characters, who's doing what, who's this person, etc. But then there's all those background references going to be happening, and they could be mythological or political or cultural or historical. So I'll give you an example. If we have a pretty simple sentence like the young men blocked the Tribune in the Forum, that's to translate. That's a pretty easy sentence to translate. But let's understand the background references. Who is a Tribune? What's a Tribune? What's the importance of blocking them? Well, a Tribune, it was the representative of the common people, the tribunes of the plebs. And under law, they were not allowed to be physically blocked at all. The Forum is where everything happens politically in Rome. So that sentence, far from being a fairly vanilla one, is actually a really highly political charge. It shows a bunch of people breaking the law in a very extreme way. So you've got to have all that background knowledge to be able to make sense, to understand what's really happening in the sentence and in the passage. The outcome for that, so again, after we've studied this as a class, you've got to answer questions on the content. So that's the basics of the plot, the characters, etc., who's doing what. But also the context, and there are all those background details which make these things so much richer. And also consider what's the point the author's trying to make, what's the author's purpose, because very often the Romans aren't just writing to tell a story, there's a hidden motive behind what they're trying to tell us. And it's useful to try to work out what that is. Area of Study 3 is a little bit different. Translating original Latin, so the focus here is on your translation skills. And it could be done as part of the scene text work, but much more likely it'll be done as unseen translations. So scene, remember, is when we study the text together in class and then you test it on it. Unseen is when a bit of Latin you've never seen before is just put in front of you and bang, you've got to translate it on the spot. So it's a real test of your grammar, your dictionary skills, your vocab to some extent. The outcome they've got is pretty simple. Can you translate the passage into fluent English? And can you answer questions on the grammar of the passage? So that's really to check that it's not just luck that you've got the answer right, but do you actually know why? Why grammatically things are happening. The assessment side of it is probably a bit disappointing for you because it really doesn't say all that much. The VCAA at Units 1 and 2 are only interested in that binary satisfactory or non-satisfactory completion. It's either a yes or no, S or N, satisfactory or non-satisfactory completion of it. And they put out a bare minimum for that. Now, your schools will almost certainly have much more that's required for assessment, and I think you need it. The satisfactory, non-satisfactory completion says, yep, in your Latin journey, yep, you're on the road you're meant to be on. But no indication of whereabouts you are, how far you progressed, what you've got to go to next. And that's the information which you need to have if you were to get on. So expect your schools to overlay their own assessment for Units 1 and 2 on top of this. Getting that satisfactory, non-satisfactory, well, they list a whole bunch of outcomes which they've got there, and the how is left up to the teachers. So as you can see there, outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3, they have a series of suggestions. The teacher might choose to do all of these, or just one of these, or maybe none of them and choose something completely different, and that's perfectly allowable. The outcomes might be tested by one task or a whole bunch of tasks. Many of you will find that you've done them without even noticing that you've done them. It's just part of the normal work of what you do. And in a way, that's the way these things should be. They should just be part of what you normally do for your Latin that you've done here. So that's our brief look at Unit 1 Latin, a little intro for you. If you've got any questions, then please pop them in the comments. I'll be doing a few more videos to help you with your VCE Latin, and just a blatant plug that I've got some resources you can have to help you with your Latin study on my website, latinstudyresources.com. Cheers and good luck with your Latin studies.